Welcome to the Earth Day screening and panel discussion of Sonic Sea, brought to you by Oceans at Duke and Duke's chapter of the Coastal Society. My name is Juliette Lee. I am the Oceans at Duke Student Cabinet Treasurer. Oceans at Duke is an interdisciplinary network of faculty and students from across all departments of Duke University who are committed to ocean sustainability. The Oceans at Duke Student Club is a space for oceans-minded students to engage with ocean experts across science, governance, and business about ocean topics. The student cabinet and club members include students across the different graduate schools, Nicholas, Fuqua, Pratt, Law, and Stanford. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Eva.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Eva May, the current president of the Coastal Society at Duke and the Strategic Action Planning co-chair of the Oceans at Duke Student Cabinet. The Coastal Society is a national network of students and professionals across government, academia, and the private sector. The Society works toward addressing and solving emerging coastal and ocean issues through cross-disciplinary collaboration and education. We have 6 total student chapters, including ours, and each one is committed to furthering the mission of TCS as a whole and raising awareness of coastal issues on campus by hosting education and networking opportunities for our fellow students. We thank you so much for joining us for this panel, where we will discuss the Emmy Award-winning film Sonic Sea. Our panelists will discuss the impacts of anthropogenic noise on ocean life and describe solutions to address this challenge. Let me provide a few guidelines for our session today before we get started. This event will be 60 minutes total, including a panel discussion with our experts and a Q&A session in the last 10 to 15 minutes. Your microphones are currently muted and will remain so for the session, but we encourage you to keep your videos on and to share your questions and comments in the chat, which will be monitored by our team. We also encourage you to visit the Oceans at Duke website to see additional articles and resources related to this topic. Details on our panelists today and descriptions of future events we'll be hosting. Today's session will also be recorded and posted on the website later this week.
It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Doug Nowacek, who is a professor here at Duke of Conservation Technology and Environment and Engineering, and holds positions both at the Nicholas School for the Environment at Duke Marine Lab and with the Pratt School of Engineering. He obtained his Ph.D. from MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Doug's research is focused on the acoustic ecology of marine animals, primarily mammals, specifically how they use sound in ecological processes. One of his specific areas of research is the use of sound in the foraging ecology of these animals. Another focus of his current research is the effects of anthropogenic noise on marine mammals, including pioneering the Global Alliance for Ocean Noise with Dr. Brandon Southall. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers and has given hundreds of presentations nationally and internationally to scientific, regulatory, congressional, and general public audiences on the issue of ocean noise. And now I'll hand it over to Doug to kick off our conversation.
Super, thanks, Juliette. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially for me to get to have a conversation with these 3 awesome, excellent panelists. And these 3 are in really the middle of this whole discussion from a couple different perspectives. So Brandon Southall is a longtime friend and colleague who is, as he calls himself, a quasi-academic who runs an environmental consulting company. And Brandon was with NOAA for several years working on this very issue, and now is in California. And as Juliette said, we have started to think about some novel ways to address ocean noise in our Global Alliance. Michael Jasny, another longtime friend and colleague at the National Resources Defense Council. I didn't realize this until today that he said that he's been at NRDC since a year out of law school. So that's a long and storied career. Michael's done amazing things to get us to think about these issues quite deeply and wisely. And Lee Kindberg, who I have not had the pleasure to work with nearly as much, I look forward to it. Lee is at Maersk Line and is a Duke alum, and we're delighted to have her. And so just thinking about this issue from just the three perspectives that we have represented here is a really good way to have a discussion about these things. So we get, we get input from folks with representing different groups themselves sometimes, but also different stakeholders and how they approach this issue. So without further ado, we'll get started, and we have some questions for the panelists, and I'll leave it up to them whether they want to how they want to handle questions as far as, but the group's going to be monitoring the chat, so I'll also watch it and see if we can find some follow-ups. So I'm going to start with Brandon, if that's okay. Brandon, is a scientist, what do you see as the best strategy to address challenges for many species with variable behavioral responses and biological sensitivities in response to noise?
Thanks, Doug, and thank you to everyone that's put this on for inviting me here today. It's a really important question, in the scope of this whole issue, and the movie gets into this to some extent. So much of the early focus was on these stranding events, these mortal events that have occurred in various places around the world in conjunction with sonar and certain species of whales. And so much of the early focus was really on mortality, and a lot of the focus has been on these hearing effects that can happen for really loud sounds. But I think we've realized, while those things are important and we continue to work on them and need to figure that out, the sublethal behavioral kind of effects are certainly more widespread in terms of the number of animals that are experiencing exposures that may cause them to change their behavior. And I think we've, as the question alludes to, we've realized that there's a high degree of variability between certain species, like the beaked whales, which have been involved in these strandings, and harbor porpoises that are just these very sensitive animals. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, some animals like longfin pilot whales, and to some extent, some of the humpback whales in certain circumstances that are really pretty tolerant to sound, or even sometimes attracted to sound for different reasons. So the complexity, and there's a whole bunch of things in between, and there's wrinkles to it about what animals are doing at the time may affect it. So there's a lot of complexity in it, not all of which can be reflected. I think, to answer your question directly, we need to kind of clump some of these groups in terms of their behavioral sensitivity into those kinds of categories, where you have a particularly sensitive category that either they respond very, very strongly, or there's conditions like they're endangered and you just don't want to be wrong, and then a more tolerant category, and then probably kind of one that fits in the middle, something that or different contexts that may cause animals to be more sensitive or less sensitive. So we can't reflect all the complexity that exists with like a different probability function for every species or every individual. It's impractical. But centering around 3 or 4 or 5 kinds of categories that aren't hinged on hearing data. That's one of the important things. We've sort of, some of the early work kind of made these same assumptions about hearing and behavior that just don't, just because animals hear similarly doesn't mean that they're necessarily behaviorally similar.
It's complicated, that's for sure. Thanks, Brandon. Okay, Michael, if you could target one legislative change or action to address the ocean noise issue and support innovation in the industry, what legislation piece would you work through, and what would you do?
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and it's great to be here with Brandon and Lee and you and everybody today. So it's funny, I was on a panel last week with Brandon as well, and was asked a similar question. So maybe there's something in the air, a moment of possibility that we all see. The logical answer here, the first place one would think to go in answering this question, would be our wildlife protection statutes. And I myself have a deep, passionate relationship with the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act. You might also think about the U.S. Endangered Species Act as well. But I am not going to say Marine Mammal Protection Act or Endangered Species Act. but rather look a little further afield. One of the problems that we have with the conservation management for ocean noise is that the statutes that have been used to deal with the problem only indirectly. What they're about is regulating the impacts, not regulating the source. Just as I think there has been a real movement in the field from only focusing on the biology, thinking of ocean noise as a biological problem, to thinking of ocean noise as, at least in part, an engineering problem. I think we need to make a similar sort of transition for purposes of devising policy. And so if I could change one thing, if I can make one legislative change in US domestic law and federal law, it would be within the Clean Water Act. And it would be about modifying the definition of pollutant in the Clean Water Act so that definition clearly encompasses underwater noise. That would certainly be something that can spur innovation in the industry. Now, short of that, there are a number of other things that we could do. There's presently there's a bill that was introduced last October in the House. We're expecting it to be reintroduced in a couple months. It's called the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act. It contains a number of provisions related to ocean noise and designed to try to among other things, spur innovation. One of its provisions would establish a grant program. So at least US flag vessels, and there aren't a lot of them when you consider the global ocean, but that could at least allow US flag vessels to receive grants for incorporating noise quieting measures into their new vessel designs and retrofits. And there are all kinds of things, other things you can do along those lines that are in that bill as well. I'm not very skilled at putting links in chats, but we'll somehow get you a link to the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, and you can see at least some of the ideas along these lines that are floating. So, in short, for me, the one change I would make if I could wave my magic legislative wand would be modifying the Clean Water Act. But short of that, there are a number of other things we could do to spur on quiet design solutions in the shipping industry. Thanks.
Very cool, and probably not the answer that a lot of people expected. I think it's a really interesting way to go about that. Very cool. Well, Lee, if you're ready, again, thanks so much for joining us and making Duke proud. The first question for you is about transitioning the shipping sector to more renewable fuels and greener operation. What are the noise implications of that transition, and how do you see the shipping industry adapting to resolve these paired issues of climate change and noise pollution? So thanks, Lee.
Well, first, let me thank you again for the opportunity to be on the panel with these distinguished folks. And thanks for the invitation. It's always interesting to work with Duke, but I must say I'm not a Duke alum. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
We have done work with several of your capstone projects, but I'm not a Duke alum. My kids are TIP alums, but
got it. We'll take you anyway.
That may be what you were seeing, but I'm glad to be adopted. I also just want to put in a bookmark that, Michael, I disagree with you on defining noise as a pollutant. But that's a longer discussion. So getting back to your question, Doug, climate is absolutely the challenge of the century. And those of us who've been working hard, first of all, on energy efficiency to reduce our CO2 emissions, have been doing a lot of retrofitting on vessels. And it happened that we were able to work with Scripps on a study that we'd done on that retrofit. And we were able to identify that at least on one particular set of vessels that we retrofitted, the changes that we made also reduced underwater noise. Now, that's not to say that every efficiency change that you make is going to result in underwater noise. You have to go and measure, you have to test, and there's no really good way to do that. So this is, I guess, a long answer to what should have been a briefer question. But we have to have ways to standardize and know where we are and how things are impacting. I'm doing a study right now with Scripps Institute that's a follow-on to the study that, Michael, you've heard of before, that says that with a bigger data set, we may have a more complex picture, but there is still a reduction at the lowest frequencies.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. And I mean, it's okay with me if if one of the three of you or two want to have a larger discussion around one of these questions that gets posed to one of you. So if you have thoughts or additions or whatever to one of the questions, please just pipe up. Good. Okay. Back to Brandon. The film talked a lot about whales and dolphins, not so much about seals and sea lions. So just a question about how pinnipeds are affected by ocean noise. Do they have different methods or mechanisms for dealing with it or escaping from it?
Yeah, great question, Doug. And I've had the privilege of doing a lot of work. In fact, all my graduate school work was on seals and sea lions. And they're just, I mean, I partially got interested in kind of amazed by them because they do such extreme things. They're amphibious animals, so they do important things with sound both above and below the water. They can see well both in air and underwater. They have some remarkable adaptations that allow them to use the conventional way of hearing both in air and underwater. It's why you can't hear very well when you go underwater. You can't localize sound, but they can. So they're very acoustic animals. They use sounds for very important things that they do, and in some ways it's a shame that that we do have this sort of cetacean bias in some of the awareness about this, because many of the pinnipeds and particularly the true seals, the phocid seals, the earless seals, are very, very sensitive to low frequency hearing. They make low frequency sounds. They're kind of more like whales. In fact, we think we don't have direct hearing data from whales, but we've done some low free. In fact, we're doing some really low frequency 30-40 hertz frequency hearing tests with seals, phocid seals in the lab here in Santa Cruz right now. And they're just quite sensitive at the low frequencies. They're probably reasonably good proxies for whales, and they're probably much more sensitive to some of the low frequency noise that travels really far in the ocean and is pervasive from some of our kind of more continuously present sources in the ocean, like shipping, than dolphins and porpoises are, that hear at these really high frequencies. So that they're an important group to consider at the low frequencies where a lot of the noise exists. And on the flip side, they're actually we've seen that in terms of the sounds it takes to cause their hearing to be damaged, they're actually quite resilient too, though, which wouldn't surprise you if you ever go to a sea lion rookery when there's a whole bunch of seals around. It's one of the noisiest places you can imagine being. So they expose themselves to a lot of noise as well. But yeah, they kind of get lost in the whale centric flipper centric way of looking at things. But there are a lot of them, and they're very sound is very important to them.
Awesome, thanks. Anything, Michael or Lee, on pinnipeds? other than they're hairy and they smell bad? Sorry, Brandon. Michael, both shipping routes and animal migration span the ocean of different countries. So question about international collaboration, international jurisdictions. What are some opportunities for spanning those things, as well as maybe, a quick précis on what legal systems are there to address noise pollution problems?
Sure. And well, first of all, I just want to underscore Brandon's point about pinnipeds sometimes getting lost in the mix, because there really has been a strong focus from the very beginning on cetaceans, maybe to the detriment of pinnipeds in ocean noise policy concerning marine mammals in the U.S. I'll throw out a few examples. I mean, this is a great question, and there are a number of things that are currently going on that present opportunities and challenges for international and transboundary work. The most obvious thing to point to, for me anyway, is as an opportunity is the International Maritime Organization. So, kind of unique among the various major sectors that are engaged with this issue. The IMO is it's an international body with a kind of a competence globally over impacts on the environment from the sector, and you don't see that for anything else. Certainly not anything covered in the film. So the fact that we have a body like the IMO out there that can act in ways to help reduce noise over the world ocean is represents a fantastic opportunity. Now, in 2008, the United States proposed that ocean noise be put on the work plan at IMO. Brandon was present at the creation for that, as was I. It took us 6 years of pushing and prodding at IMO to get to the end of that work plan, which was the production of voluntary guidelines to reduce noise or underwater radiated noise from commercial shipping. And that's kind of the nature of the beast. It is a very slow-moving institution. But in the end, we got these guidelines. It's now some 7 years after they were adopted, and now 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and Australia, have proposed a new work plan on noise, starting with the review of the guidelines. What has been their uptake, and then what can be refined, improved, what next steps can be taken by IMO to help move things along. I'm assuming that the review finds that there is more that can be done by the shipping industry, by IMO, to reduce environmental impacts in the sector. So that is an exciting thing. Hopefully it'll be adopted. It is on the agenda for the next meeting of the relevant IMO committee that deals with marine environmental protection. That, given COVID, whether or not we'll actually come up and what may be a complicated agenda remains to be seen. But our fingers are certainly crossed. It has a lot of support from a variety of countries. So we're hoping we can move forward. And to me, that really is a huge opportunity. To give you another example of something that's maybe a little less 40,000 foot, a little closer to the ground or the water. I can point to my backyard, which is the Pacific Northwest, the Salish Sea. And I think, as a lot of folks know, we have an endangered, iconic population of southern resident orcas, southern resident orcas, that live in my neck of the woods and have critical habitat in the Salish Sea. Now, their habitat is split between U.S. and Canadian jurisdictions, which makes management of this species very, very difficult. Makes it difficult for prey availability, making sure they have enough salmon, which they don't. It's a challenge on the ocean noise side as well. I'm part of an advisory working group run out of the Port of Vancouver that has established a number of operational measures to reduce noise from commercial vessels over the last 7 years. The latest of those measures involves slowing down vessels as they are leaving the Port of Vancouver, going through an area called Swift Shore Bank. It's very, very important to this population. This bank is a transboundary problem. It occurs on both sides of the border, and over the next couple years, we are going to be working hard with our U.S. counterparts, with the U.S. Coast Guard, with the Northwest Seaport Alliance, with the state of Washington, hopefully with NOAA, to work out some integrated mitigation for ships moving through this area. And it is going to be a real test of our ability to work productively with the complications of two entirely different legal regimes. And the last example, I know I've been talking for a while, but what the heck, the last example I'm going to throw out, which is a real challenge. I mean, a bigger challenge than the one I just named, and it's somewhere between the 40,000 foot and the sea surface level of the Salish Sea, is the Arctic. The Arctic represents a huge challenge. And I've been talking a lot about shipping, and I'll try to talk about other things too, but it's a real challenge because, as we know, with melting ice, there's a great deal of economic opportunity in the Arctic. Some circumpolar states, and particularly Russia, is trying to expand vessel use of the area with, I think, initial construction of ports, and with that will come probably military exercises, because navies are going to have to protect those vessels. There's interest in mineral exploration in the Arctic. It's a huge challenge. And one of the things that I always like to say when we're talking to a group of students is that there are certain places where you can really devote your time, where you could potentially devote your careers, places that urgently need the attention of people across a variety of disciplines, whether it's law or biology or engineering. And I think the Arctic is really one of those places, and for a lot of reasons, with as the oceans warm, but ocean noise, dealing with increasing human use of the sea that will follow the retreat of sea ice. That is something that I think it could be of interest to a lot of people here, and could be the work of a lifetime. Thanks.
Very cool. I like the different levels of those examples, Michael, and they really are several different structures. So I would just throw it to Lee, especially maybe particularly just on the IMO, or Brandon if you have comments. But yeah, please, Lee.
Okay, and can you hear me, Doug?
Absolutely.
Okay. I've been having some technical problems today, so everybody bear with me. I just wanted to follow on to Michael, and I don't think you're taking enough credit for some of the things that you caused to happen. Canada is definitely world leading in dealing with underwater noise in a variety of ways, and has been leading the charge to try to get IMO to take up this work stream again. And of course, as you know, Michael, I've been supportive of some of that work. I also think you don't take enough credit for the voluntary programs that have been in place under the ECHO program for 7 years now. And we've participated all those years and have gotten better at it and better at it. And we keep adding on new areas, and we have to teach our ships to get better at that one too. So it's not as if there is nothing going on out there at Swift Shore Bank or in Vancouver. There are these, I think, really well developed voluntary programs that have involved industry and many other stakeholders, and a lot of good science happening. There are hydrophones where they're actually measuring all kinds of great things happening, and reports to the public. And that's where a lot of the good science is happening that is, let's say, approachable by those of us who are actually operating vessels, and where we can actually make a difference by doing certain behaviors. And they've actually found ways to help fund if we have increased cost because of that. For example, if you have to have an extra pilot on board or something like that, that's a pretty significant cost. Then they've actually found ways to make it work. And they've worked with the stakeholders of all sorts to try to say, what speeds will we try this year for these different types of vessels, because different types of vessels have different noise generation profiles. So they've done some really great work. And I think, Michael, you've been a part of that all this time, and probably ought to take more credit for it.
Well, and I think one of the things that oh, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I just want to thank Lee for that, and I mean, ECHO is a great program. Folks should look at everything that Lee said is just right on the money. One of the things that's really impressive to me is just the level of participation by industry in that program is remarkable. I have never seen. I mean, my bias is always towards regulation. It's just what I'm trained to do.
You're a lawyer.
Exactly, and I, and it's true that if you look at how voluntary, if you look at the uptake of voluntary industry programs, it's frequently disappointing. But there are huge, there's some major exceptions to that, and ECHO is absolutely one of them. And I think it's a real reflection of governance, of the way in which the port, working with the government of Canada, bringing in industry, has really created a feeling of collective participation. The participation rates on the water are now between, there are a number of different ways to figure it, but they're between 80 to 90% for the various measures which is just to say that 80 to 90% of vessels that are traveling through the water space of the subject of these mitigation measures are slowing down or changing their position relative to the sea lanes in order to reduce noise in southern resident habitats. So it's a really good program, and we're trying to propagate it, trying to get it replicated by other ports, beginning with the Port of Seattle. There are some folks from NOAA who are working in the Gulf of Mexico and thinking about trying to get something going with ports down there that can try to replicate the success of ECHO. Be great if we can bottle it and get it distributed.
Yeah, very nice. We're ready to move on. Any other thoughts on the IMO or governance or UNCLAWS?
Well, I guess one last point about IMO, it does move slowly and deliberately, but then when it does put something in place, it is enforceable around the world.
Right.
And we really, this is going to sound crazy, but we really advocate for enforcement because that's what creates that level playing field.
Right.
I guess the one thing I would add, Doug, and I think this is somewhat reflected in the film, but it's also evident in the panel that you have here, is in that IMO process. and there were several papers written about it. And if you look at the affiliations in that IMO process, you had people from the industry, people from government, people from the research space, people from nonprofits that worked together on that came together. And that has not been the case in some of the other spaces for ocean noise, especially with, Navy, and, people sometimes have a hard time getting sued by other people, which I can understand. But I'm just saying, I think one of the takeaways that I had from that whole process was, and Michael and I were at this kind of amazing meeting where a lot of this kind of came together for the first time, and had people that might on other issues be on very different sides of the table, sitting down and working together. And that's where I think the field needs to continue going. And it's really important. I'm seeing some things about offshore wind in the chat. We're hoping to keep that same type of discussion, focus on science, conservation where it makes sense. I'm going to respond on the vessel speed reduction question to Heather in a second, but we need to be guided by science and to make decisions that aren't just blanket things that go everywhere, but that think about where and when do things make sense, and are they needed? And there needs to continue to be respectful dialogue and disagreement sometimes with people that come from different perspectives. But that has been the case in the shipping realm, and it really wasn't in the seismic, the sonar realm, and seismic surveys for oil and gas too. It's just it started acrimonious and got worse a bit, and we've been better in this space, as we should be, I think.
Yeah. Nice, great discussion. Super. Okay, I think we are on to Lee's second question, if I am not mistaken. And Lee, I would say if you look around the screen, you'll see a lot of predominance of women over men. And so there's a question from the students about your experience in building a career in a largely male-dominated shipping sector, particularly the part concerned with environment. And what advice might you offer to those seeking to enter similar fields to overcome those challenges?
Well, my degrees are in chemistry. And if you want to talk about a male-dominated sector,
Oh, right.
I spent the first 23 years of my career in the chemical industry.
Wow.
So, and was the first woman in every single job I held in that industry.
Wow.
So we're not talking ancient history here.
Yeah.
I came to Maersk 16 years ago and was relieved to find that I did not have to turn on the lights in the ladies' room.
Oh, wow, there's somebody else.
There are actually a surprising number of women moving even up into middle management, and we have 3 female members of our board now, our global board. We're headquartered in Copenhagen, Denmark. So we're making real progress on diversity, and I think shipping is probably ahead of certainly where chemicals was when I left it. And I haven't looked at the stats on chemicals, but in terms of things that can make a difference, first of all, don't be too thin-skinned. People aren't always out to get you. Sometimes they are, but they aren't always. I read something once that said when a woman takes off her jacket, she takes off her authority. So there's still a double standard. And I see here I'm kind of, dressed up, and the guys are much more comfortable. But the reality is that there is still sort of a double standard in the image that you portray, and what shall we call this? The realm of mistakes that you can make. And you have to ask more for feedback, but do it in a way that is professional rather than insecure. The book Lean In is something that ought to be required reading, although I disagree with her on some things. But as you've noticed, when I disagree with somebody, I tell them.
Great.
So I hope that's helpful. And then, have your written and organized work plans and keep track of what you're actually accomplishing, both for your own sanity and to be able to measure what you've accomplished when it comes to annual appraisal time.
Got it. Very cool. Thank you. Great to hear that history. Yeah, Brand.
Can I just briefly just comment on something and maybe just connect it to something that we're trying to work on, which, I think in the field of marine mammal research and science, we definitely have seen a lot more representation from women scientists in that field in the last few years. I think where we still have a lot of work to do is to get a broader racial representation in the community. And there's been a lot of debate and discussion and efforts to try and do that. That's kind of coming around. Our society is grappling with that issue very, very directly. A nonprofit called California Ocean Alliance that I'm working with has tried to act in this space a bit, and we have some education programs and some mentoring internship programs that we're trying to reach out to some of our communities around here, primarily Latino communities, and give a fair opportunity and awareness and representation to some of the communities that have been somewhat underrepresented in this field too. So I'll maybe drop that program into the chat, and people could check it out. It's an online program that we've done, but we've specifically reached out to some of those schools and tried to engage and provide scholarships for kids to participate in this class, because it's an area. I mean, clearly there are still obstacles to people that are not white and male as I am, and that goes for women, but I think some of we've done better there. We've got more work to do to get more racial equity in our field.
Yeah.
And that's true with women and with other types of diversity. In terms of particular assignments, you don't see many women at sea.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, those folks live on those vessels for 60 or 90 days at a shot. And during COVID, sometimes it was a year, because there was no country that would let you get off.
Oh my gosh.
So that, so we're talking about, but I also know that Kathy Metcalf, who is president of the Chamber of Shipping of America, went to sea. And I'm beginning to know more and more women who graduated from Kings Point, which is the U.S. Maritime Academy, and are bringing those skills in, have actually gone to sea, and then are bringing their skills to the land side of the business too. But definitely there's a cultural difference, a diversity difference across different types of activities and assignments.
Yeah, cool.
Doug, sorry, this is really interesting, and I just wanted to add the kind of environmental nonprofit perspective on this, which is I think that there's finally been a kind of an awakening within the environmental NGO community about our own lack of diversity. I mean, it's for a long time, I think people at NGOs regarded the lack of diversity as a pipeline problem that was external to our own hiring processes. Well, we just don't see enough people of color, for example, coming up through the pipeline and therefore available to be interviewed for jobs. And while there that is partly true, I mean there's a lot more that needs to be done with kids and earlier stages of education, which is I think partly what Brandon has been doing with California Action, Ocean Action, right? There's to some degree our organizations have been very narrow in how we've gone about hiring searches and how we've thought about qualifications that have made the whole thing kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's I think finally been I know DC, a lot of other organizations are going through I think a genuine reconsideration of how it is that we hire, and also how it is that we work with communities of color in our campaign and advocacy efforts as well. So anyway, I mean, this is itself, I mean, it's such a worthwhile topic and worth its own panel discussion. But I just wanted to let folks know that it's at least there's an effort at change happening in environmental NGOs as well.
Yeah, it's good. It's very good to hear. Cool. Well, believe it or not, it's already 5:45, and I see Brandon just popped an answer into the chat, so that's great. But what I'd like to do now is, first of all, thank the three of you. Among other things, the topic itself, but also just the ability to sit and have a dialogue. And obviously, there's disagreements and there's different thought processes, but there's a lot of agreement as well, and a lot of things to find common ground, but also ways to find progress and movement ahead. So just, kudos to the three of you. I know that Lee's support of the various things at IMO and Michael and Brandon, fighting from their own sides, not fighting, but working hard and finding those common grounds. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Juliet and to Eva May to moderate the Q&A from the students. It's an honor and a pleasure to be a faculty member at Duke, where you have these fantastic students come through and take initiative and really run with things. So while we get named as like faculty mentors and things, it's more like bystanders just watching the action. So I really am glad to have the two of them and the rest of the students on here in the spotlight to ask you all some questions. So thanks again for participating.
Yes, thank you, Doug, and thank you all for having such a compelling conversation. So as Doug mentioned, we will now be opening the conversation to an audience Q&A. We encourage you all to ask your questions either about the film, about the challenge or solutions of ocean noise, or even career questions for our panelists. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and our team will monitor them, and Eva and I will go back and forth bringing them to or addressing them out loud. And if we don't get to all of your questions, we will try to get to them and send out answers later in an email. But yeah, Eva, please take it away.
Sure. So Brandon already addressed this in the chat. Thank you. But from Heather Fowle, we have, do you think that speed restrictions should be in place in a similar manner to the US worldwide to help prevent ship strikes and also to possibly reduce cavitation noise and help reduce the masking of whale and dolphin communications, as has been done for the North Atlantic right whale? And I wanted to add on to this. Additionally, we were talking about enforcement. If we were to put in place speed restrictions and speed limits, are these enforceable on global shipping routes with our current capacity in this space?
May I jump in on that one?
Please do.
The NOAA does currently enforce, to a certain extent, the speed limits they have on the Atlantic coast for the North Atlantic right whale, and Transport Canada does enforce their speed limits that are in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for the same species, which is at a critically low level. We've really all got to do what we need to try to save that species. And I've lost track of the question. Sorry about that.
Sorry, it was quite long.
It was.
So are these enforceable on a global scale? And
well, it depends. The answer is it depends. In terms of enforceability, it would have to be enacted by IMO for it to be enforceable. But let me point something out about reality. 90% of the world's goods move by water. And the amount that moves is not going to decrease 50% if you cut the speed limit by 50%. And by the way, the vessels currently are going less than 20 miles an hour. So let's, we're not talking about the difference between 50 and 80. We're talking about the difference between what's called, 20 knots and 15 knots or 10 knots. So what we've done in the various voluntary programs that are out there, like the ECHO program, has set a 14.5 knot speed limit in certain specific areas where we know there are areas of concern. What NOAA's done on the East Coast is a 10 knot speed limit, and that's really to prevent or to reduce the probability of fatal outcomes if there is a collision between a whale and a ship. And they've taken that down to 10 knots. The problems you run into, though, is if you cut that speed limit in half, you're talking about having double the number of vessels to carry the same world's cargo. Or you're talking about a lot more air freight, which has 50 to 100 times the carbon footprint of shipping by water. So you've got to be real careful here about those kinds of trade-offs. But I absolutely support in areas of sensitive areas like the ECHO programs areas or the East Coast ports and so forth. Choose, if you've got a seasonal situation, make it a seasonal requirement. If you've got a area of great sensitivity, focus on that area and do it right. And don't just try to say, oh, we'll make it a global speed limit, and which runs into all kinds of other unintended consequences like climate.
Thank you, Lee. Michael or Brandon, would either of you like to respond to that question as well?
I think it's kind of congruous with what I was saying in the chat too, and then with noise, there are these other trade-offs too, right? If you slow vessels down, you're keeping them in an area where there's noise for longer. I mean, that still might be a win from a noise perspective, but to me, there was more, and I won't get into the details of it, but there's parts of when the ships were actually going quite a bit faster than I think some of them are now for other economic reasons. The effect of slowing ships from a noise output perspective was a little greater than it is now. If you slow a ship from 20 to 15 knots or 15 to 10 knots, you actually don't really quiet it. For most of the ships, you don't quiet it by that much. So again, I agree. It should be targeted. These kind of blanket approaches probably don't make sense. And then with noise, there's a few little wrinkles. I mean, I think generally speaking, ships going slower have a lower risk of ship strikes in general. But with noise, it's not quite that simple exactly all the time. That's all I was trying to say.
Yeah, I will say that the areas where vessel slowdowns would have a benefit and are urgently needed are kind of under targeted right now in the United States. So we can think of a number of important areas for particularly endangered species that could benefit for a ship slowdown and yet are not presently the subject of one. So for example, a species that has gotten a lot of recent attention in the news is the Gulf of Mexico whale. It's been dubbed Rice's whale. I see some people nodding that you've been following this. Recently identified as a unique baleen whale species, and its only known habitat is in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Well, within this broader stretch of habitat along the shelf break, it has core habitat in the eastern Gulf within a particular submarine canyon known as the DeSoto Canyon. We know that at least one of these whales has died of ship strike, and there's some questions about a few others. There are fewer than 100 left. The best estimate that NOAA has is 51. So it's imperative that we reduce the risk of ship strikes, in particular on that species within its core habitat. But as yet, there there is no a management effort along those lines. So that's just an example. I can think of a couple of others too, just to suggest that even if we're not talking about global change along these lines, which I agree has positives and negatives, there's still a lot of work to be done in protecting particularly vulnerable species and habitat off our coasts.
And Michael, there is an effort being made right now to organize a group to work on, is it the Bride's Whale or Bryce's Whale? I never can remember whether it's a C or a D.
It's changing. You don't have to bother with it.
Oh,
Thank God, because it's, it used to be Brutus whale, named after, what was it, 19th century Norwegian naturalist, and
gosh.
it's and nobody knows how to pronounce it. It's sort of et2 Brutus, but it's not spelled Brutus. So it was very confusing. Anyway, it's been renamed with the recognition of its uniqueness.
Well,
to
the point that I
well.
also wanted to make, great, that's good to know. The point I wanted to make though is that they reached out to me, for example, to be part of an effort to try to figure out what to do about it. But I think whoever was assembling it, unfortunately, didn't understand the time demands that we're under in industry and was trying to schedule several all-day sessions over a short time period. And so perhaps some discussion about how can we make this work for industry might be something that those of you who are in policy and so forth might want to make a note, that you need to be sure that the people that you need at the table can get to the table, and that the scheduling demands that you're putting on there aren't selecting down to exclude some of the people that you need.
That's great. Thank you so much, all of you, for bringing such compelling ideas to this conversation. Another question we have in the chat is from Cassidy White, thinking specifically about the blasting from oil and gas exploration discussed in the film. As the US and global energy mix shifts towards renewables, hopefully leading to a decline in demand for oil and gas, would any associated decline in blastings be enough to contribute to a decrease in ocean noise?
I'll start with this one. You know, the shift from to seismic air guns was from explosions. Like, it was not really that long ago where that was actually literally blasting, basically creating this intense low frequency energy that goes into the ground and reflects and is used as a form of imaging. I think it's important to realize that technology is not just used for oil and gas. It's used for geophysical research and, you know, things that people need in places to understand plate tectonics and the likelihood of tsunamis in the Northwest, you know, so Michael doesn't get, you know, have a tsunami come into Puget Sound, or if they do, they have some early warnings. So there are scientific applications of those tools, but just like there was a pivot from throwing a stick of dynamite in the water to a controlled, you know, compressible air, there is new technology that is coming about. It's kind of been slowed a bit as this pivot from, you know, because the oil and gas industry was really moving that forward, you know, with the change that's happening, the good change that's happening away from that conventional oil and gas. Some of this is maybe going a little slower than it was, but there are new technologies to do that. Things called marine vibrosize, which is kind of how they do it on land. You shake something at really low frequency, basically, and it's a little more tunable to not give you all of this. You really only care about the part that's all the way on the left keys of the piano. You don't need the whole piano to play at the same time, which is what happens when you make a big bang. So it's a little more tunable. So hopefully some of that will continue moving forward, because even if there's not as much seismic for offshore oil and gas, there is still, you know, a need and a presence of that kind of survey for things like geophysical and benthic mapping and stuff.
I will say though, you know, the lion's share of seismic exploration or high energy seismic exploration is attributable to the oil and gas industry. So there is, there is a very significant potential for noise reduction as we move to a renewables future. There is some seismic that is done for purposes of identifying areas for wind turbine construction and the lay of pipelines and so on. But it is which you have to do for offshore wind farm development. But that's low energy seismic. It's almost an apples and oranges comparison. Even if we're looking at pile driving, which is represents a significant disruption, acoustic disruption of the ocean environment, and something that has to be mitigated and is also worth more discussion here. Even if we're comparing that to the high energy surveys used by the oil and gas industry, it's still something of an apples and oranges comparison. There's just so much more seismic exploration that takes place in the course of oil and gas development of an area than piling that takes place in wind farm construction. The one can just be repeated year over year for oil and gas, and for offshore renewables. You're looking at a construction season and then a long life of use. So there's offshore renewables, offshore wind still puts noise in the water, but the duration of that noise, and where we're talking about seismic activities, the amplitude of the sound, I mean, it's just completely different, and comparatively far more benign.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was great. I think Eva is going to close us out, but that was very interesting, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to speak with us today.
Yes, so thank you again to our wonderful speakers today for a fascinating and insightful conversation, as well as to our audience for joining us for this crucial conversation. We will be sure to gather answers from today's panelists for the audience questions we couldn't get to, because I know we had a couple more in the chat, but we are out of time. And we'll send along those answers with a recording for this session in the next several days. In closing, we hope you'll return to hear more from the Oceans at Duke Network about the future of our oceans. Please join us on May 11th when Megan Dunphy-Daly from Duke will share more about her work on plastic pollution. And also don't forget to check out the Oceans at Duke website for details on future webinars, recordings of past sessions, and a sign up for our newsletter. You can also learn more about the Coastal Society at Duke by finding us on Facebook and Instagram at Duke Coastal Society, all one word. And you can sign up for our listserv in the link that will be shared in the chat in a minute. I thank you again for taking the time to listen today, and I look forward to seeing you all at our future collaborations between the Coastal Society and the Oceans at Duke Student Club.
Thanks, Brandon.